let's talk about qualified immunity, right?
Yeah.
That's one of the things that everybody wants to talk about. What are the actual next steps moving forward? What can we actually do? Are we going to continue throwing tear gas at each other? No, it's not going to solve anything.
No, it's not getting us anywhere.
Are you going to are you going to revolt? Well, if you're going to do it, do it. But that's not going to end very well for you. So what it comes down to is there are some actionable things that we can do when it comes to actually making changes in these communities. One of them is changes to qualified immunity, right? It doesn't need to go away, but it needs to be amended, right? It does need to be amended, and there needs to be amendment to police officer unions, because police officer unions, at the end of the day, protect police officers even when they do things that are wrong. We know that from the police officer who got arrested for killing George Floyd. He's still going to get his pension, right? That's absolutely unacceptable, right? So there needs to be changes. I mean, as a Republican, I'm against unions anyway. I don't think there should be unions. But if there's going to be a union, if there's going to be a police officers union, then it absolutely needs to, there needs to be an amendment where if you do something egregious, you get removed from that pension program. You release from your pension program. And there needs to be steps put into place where if other police officers are aware of these acts and they do not do anything, they are disciplined as well, right? Because if you have 1,000 good cops and 100 bad cops, and those 900 good cops don't say anything when those other 100 bad cops act out and do something wrong, you've got 1,000 bad cops. So there has to be a change in the way that that's looked at, and that starts at the union. Because if they don't have anything to lose, if they can go out there and act like a fool and they still get their pension, they still get their pay, then what's keeping them from, what's at the end of the day, maybe there's that check and balance. Immunity, what we talked about before, it needs to be amended. All right. And the reason why it's because when the Supreme Court put it into place, it was so broad. It was basically if you did anything that was considered an okay action as a police officer or in your line of duty, it's basically what the line says, in your line of duty, then you can be protected by this immunity clause. So it just has to be that a police officer says he felt his life was in danger. His life doesn't actually have to be in danger. He just has to feel like his life is in danger. And then all of a sudden he's under this Qualified Immunity Act. That has to be amended. The Qualified Immunity Act needs to start being more specific. And it needs to start outlining exactly in what cases these Qualified Immunity Acts can be taken. Because if not, you can just throw anything under qualified immunity. And if you're protected by the police officers union, they're going to shove everything under qualified immunity, right? Because they're there to protect the police officers to pay dues into their union. So at the end of the day, those are the two things that need to start happening immediately. There needs to be a change in the police officers union when it comes to paying out pensions to police officers that have bad reps on their record. And the worst thing about it is these police officers that were attacked. What? The police officers that were involved with George Floyd, they had multiple misconduct reports on them for the past year prior to them, getting involved with George Floyd. So these type of things need to go against them. And if you have a certain number of marks against you, then you should be taken out of the pension program. And other police officers who are aware of your misdoings and don't say anything need to be penalized as well. So that needs to be changed in the union. And then from a qualified immunity standpoint, it needs to be reworked and it needs to be made far more specific. These are the exact things that you can get away with. These are the clauses that make it change. And I'm not a lawyer, right? But this is going to have to be done at the Supreme Court level. They're going to have to completely redo that qualified immunity, completely from the top down, from a federal level. And they're going to have to break down each individual case in which qualified immunity is okay. And there needs to be clauses under each one of those cases where it says, but if this happens, it doesn't count as qualified immunity. But if this happens, it doesn't cause as qualified immunity. That way, the police officers know that they're being held more accountable and they can't just be shut under this broad spectrum of qualified immunity. Now let's talk about, go ahead. Do you have a response to that?
Yeah. Just very quick respond and we can move. To me, the qualified immunity needs to go away and it needs to be treated just like everybody else. And then also, from my view, is we need to be defunding the police and putting other sort of programs in place that are proactive to prevent crime, proactive to prevent everything that police deal with now. And we'll be talking about it more next week when we talk to Awkward again. But to me, that's the approach. You stop funding the police, you stop hiring police officers, start hiring some workers that go to houses for domestic violence and all the things that we have talked about, because that will automatically start reducing the amount of conflict situations that police officers run into. You don't have as many armed police officers going out there, and now you have service workers going to houses to respond to, again, what is at least 70% of the stuff that police deal with is nothing related to preventing crime, and it's more around domestic violence and other situations.
So
That
another
automatically helps.
thing driving this, right, is the communities, the African American community, the Black community, right? They're stepping up and saying that they're marginalized. That's kind of been drawn in with this, right? It's been against police, but it's also been, we're being marginalized. We're being fought back against, and it's been very interesting to hear the conversations when it comes to African Americans, when it comes to their community and the issues involving their community. All right, so standpoint from my end, when we look at the black community, and also not just black, by the way, if you just look at poor communities in general, like Appalachia, which is a majority white, by the way, and has a majority of the same problems that black communities have. They're extremely poor. They're in poverty. There's high drug use. There's gangs. All those kind of things tend to run rampant in those neighborhoods. They're white. Just they struggle with the same problems that the black communities do, right? Is the answer in that community to pull the police out? Pull them completely out? Well, let's look at the factors that actually drew them into this place to begin with. So if you look at factors that factor into poverty, what causes someone to be in poverty, right, below the poverty line? Well, there's a few rules here in the United States that can help you not be below the poverty line. One, graduate high school. You don't even need a college education to be that successful in America anymore. If you have a hard work ethic, you can make it happen. Graduate high school. Don't have any kids out of wedlock, right? The single parent motherhood in the African American community jumped up from 20% in the 1970s to 70% now. White people, it was at 10% then. It's at about 40% now. You look at Appalachia, you look at the poor white areas, the white, and the reason I'm bringing them into this too is because I don't want you to think that I'm just talking about poverty when it applies to black people. I'm talking about poverty, period, regardless of your color. The single motherhood rate in the Appalachian area is 70%, right? So then you start talking about, okay, so these children who are raised in these environments, right, where single motherhood is normalized, where they grow up around drug dealers, and these may be the people who they look up to in their community, and then they're always around gangs, and that just seems to be the life that they're drawn into because that's the path that everybody in their neighborhood takes, right? Is the answer in those communities just to pull police out? Because those problems are just going to get worse. They're not going to get better. They're not going to sort themselves out. All of a sudden, you're not going to have less gun violence because you pull police out. I mean, you saw that in New York City. You see that in Chicago. I mean, the police. I know that they don't pull police out, but there are neighborhoods in Chicago where police are basically unpresent because it's super dangerous for them to go in there. And the violence rate is super high, and the crime rate is super high in those areas, and people are being killed at an astronomical rate. So is the answer pull police out of there? No, the answer should be more police.
No.
The answer needs to be more police and more arrests, and eventually that pressure, right, is going to change that environment. Pulling police out is not going to fix it.
You sound like my buddy Joe Biden. That was his talk in the 90s, as we need more police, we need more officers, more arrests, and that's going to fix it. And we have done that because that happened in the 90s, and it has not given the results that we expect. And that's why the U.S. leads in incarceration, per capita compared to any other country in the world because of those policies, and it's not fixing anything. But if we see what other countries have done when they take the big budgets from the police and invest that money into the community to ensure that they have an equal opportunity, equal education, equal access to everything that you need to be successful and not be poor, then you see big success. And that happens all over Europe, and in some of the countries there, you see the quality of public education, it's the same all across the country, unlike in the US.
The state is not forcing you to drop out of high school.
No. Forget the high school.
The state is not forcing you to have a child out of wedlock.
No, let me finish, because the quality of education in the US is not the same. It varies even within cities because it's based on local taxes and many different things. So yeah, you are not forcing people to drop out of high school, but if you have shitty teachers that don't get paid money, you don't have the social fabric that needs to be there for students who have problematic parents, and you don't fund those important social programs, it doesn't matter if nobody forces you to drop out of school. You don't have a quality education.
It's a constant pullback. It's a constant pullback of self-ownership, of taking responsibility for one's own life. And instead of taking responsibility for one's own life, it's way easier to point the finger and say the reason that we're in the situation today is because of this, that, or the other. It's so much simpler. When at the end of the day, you have people who come out of poverty situations and become successful, right? You have people all the time. Those stories are rampant.
Look at those numbers and look at when you talk to them, they say, I had this one mentor or I saw this one person. And not everybody has that. Not everybody has that one figure that helps them get inspired and really get their life in line. And it's just very simple because
like a father figure.
It could be a father figure, right?
Is it possible that the degradation of the nuclear family has something to do with this? Absolutely,
that's a huge thing. Absolutely. But what I'm saying is, we have examples of what works. Just in Europe, we know what works. Make sure that education, pre-K all the way to college, is free for everybody and at the same quality. It doesn't matter if you move to a different city. It's the same quality from what you're learning to what you're eating, right? Because like in France, you see the school lunches in France, and what kids eat in poor neighborhoods and then wealthy neighborhoods, it's the same food. The materials that they learn are the same materials. The way that they learn is the same. And in the US, it's just completely different city to city. So that is one of the first places that you have to start to get people out of poverty.
Government's responsibility, right? Government's responsibility to pull us out of poverty. There's already been a war on poverty, and it absolutely failed. It absolutely failed.
Because they're doing it wrong. They're doing it wrong, Jonathan.
Because the government's involved. Get the government the freak out. And I agree with you for one thing. The way that we police needs to freaking change, right? Mass incarceration doesn't solve problems, right? Because a lot of these young kids just need guidance. They don't need to be incarcerated. Okay? So from that perspective, if we can agree that there needs to be more access to social programs when it comes to dealing with that kind of stuff. But taking them away entirely and expecting these communities to fix themselves, it's not going to work.
No, you have to have layers.
It's not going to get any better. And there is still going to need to be law enforcement in those communities. Taking law enforcement completely away is not going to help the situation at all. They need to have access to law enforcement.
Yeah, you still need law enforcement for a couple of generations until you see the trend of, violent crimes going down. And sometimes it happens really quick. And again, I give you examples of stuff that I know works, because you mentioned get the government out of it. But we don't have any examples in the real world of countries that they got the government out of it and things work out perfectly. I think Turkey is a good example because they are one of those countries that are super free market and things don't work out as they are. maybe this is a good point to transition to the HEALS Act or the Epstein, because they kind of relate to what we're talking about.
I'm processing what you said. I'm processing this ridiculousness.
So,
and I'm processing my response.
Okay. I finally watched the Epstein documentary.
I got to go back. We can't move.
Well, no, we're not. I think you'll be able to jump in. I finally watched. I think I saw one episode left. But what hit me is he was taking advantage of those families and girls who had that troubled past. Most of his victims were girls that were from poor neighborhoods, from troubled parents who had been abused before. So those girls that were in troubled situation, right? He was not going for the highly educated women in rich areas. He was on purpose targeting those poor areas. So that's how I related. I really think that if we had a better education system and better opportunity to make sure that everybody has equal access to education and whatever they need to be set up for real life, those situations wouldn't happen. You wouldn't have those girls that fall for it and then they find themselves going back and back into those situations.
This is never personal responsibility. It's never personal responsibility. It's always somebody else's fault. It's always the government for not giving us good enough schools. It's always this. It's just constant. It's the government not doing this, the government not doing that. I mean, I've seen nonstop successful stories of people who've grown up with nothing and became something. Parents were one of them. They didn't grow up with nothing, but they came from a blue-collar background. They worked really hard to get where they are at. They went through school together. So you're going to say that doesn't matter because they're white. You may not say that. That's what people say. Oh, it doesn't matter because they're white, right? They came from lower class families, right? And worked really hard to go through school and make something of themselves. But there's people of color all over this country that do that, who come from communities where everything is broken. They choose not to involve themselves in the gangs and the drugs and everything else that happens. And there's also people who come from Appalachia who grow up in extreme poverty and make it out, and then go back to service those communities. Right? Exact same. It's personal responsibility. You are personally responsible for how your life turns out. The government's not responsible for how your life turns out. The police are not responsible for how your life turns out. You're responsible for how your life turns out and the decision that you make. Your response is your responsibility, whether it's to your environment, whether it's to your school, whether it's to your home life, whatever it may be, right? Your response is your responsibility to what happens around you, whether it turns into a positive or whether it turns into a negative. Period.
Here's the problem, and then I'll use the example again. The problem is you cannot be personally responsible to the level that you would want when you don't know any better. And that's the problem. When you don't have access to quality education from early in life, when you don't have parents that are involved with you and teaching you, you don't know any better. So they are not set up for success. You cannot tell me that a baby that doesn't have parents that are involved or some motherly figure that is involved in teaching them life lessons, that they're going to make all the right decisions in life and then they're going to be successful. I guarantee you, and you can bring me any story that says, oh yeah, I did it, or I know someone who did it. I guarantee you that that's not the case. And I go back to my example. Look at countries in Europe that do ensure that everybody has access to early childhood education, that their parents are set up for success. You have way more equality, especially in the Nordic countries. Less poverty. Same thing with Japan and all those things. So they're real life examples of what you say, but there are even bigger examples of what I'm saying. And it doesn't mean that it's expensive and it's costing you money and it's the government being involved in this. It's the social fabric that you and I talk about. some of it is paid with taxes, but some of it is just caring about everybody having that equal opportunity.
I am for there being more social programs. What I'm not for is blaming the government for your lot in life. That I'm not for. Instead of looking internally and saying, "Hey, maybe there's a culture that needs to be changed here. Maybe there needs to be something fixed in our communities. Maybe we need to look after our own younger people better. Maybe we need to take better responsibility of our own lives. Maybe we need to break the cycle that we're in. Maybe it's not the government's problem that we're in the situation that we're in. Maybe it's not the government's problem." I'm not just talking about communities of color. I'm talking about people
Overall,
in poverty as well. This mentality is not just color based. You go to Appalachian, you get the same thing. It's the same thing, right? These people are literally brought up to live off government subsidy.
We have examples here. We live real close to southern Oklahoma. You go to those little towns, and it's that mentality. So I totally get where you're coming from, and personal accountability is extremely important once you know better, once you have the equal access that everybody else does. As long as there's disparities between the education that you can get and the education that I can get for free, I'm never going to be able to have that same level of accountability that you do, because you will know better because you received better education.
Better in what way? Morality? Our schools don't teach morality.
No, not morality. It can be anything. Like, I've learned a lot of morality from history and from science, etc. So it doesn't have to come from morality, but that's just one example.
Everybody has access to the internet, right?
No, not everybody.
Well, come on.
One of the big issues. Mostly. Okay. I think still a third of the U.S. doesn't have access to any reliable internet, so it's still pretty big.
You're responsible for building your own character. You can grow up in a completely toxic environment, whether that be poverty or a racist background or any sort of negative background, abusive, whatever it may be, right? And you can still come out of that being a good human being.
At what point in life, and talking about age, do you think your brain has developed enough to be able to make those decisions?
Man, I don't want to put a time limit on it. I mean, I know what psychologists will say and psychiatrists will say, but everybody's different. Everybody develops differently at a different timeline. So I think I mean there's some 12-year-olds out there who take care of their entire family basically while their parents work, and they're forced to grow up really fast, right? They're forced to take on responsibility really fast. Where some people may not be in that situation until they're between 16 and 18 years old, right? If they grow up with a regular normal nuclear family where the parents are there to help take care of them and support them even further. So it's a dependent situation, but your whatever happened to you in the past, right? Whatever happened to you in the past, whatever environment you grew up in, you still have the ability in this country to do whatever you want. You have the ability to you graduate high school. You have the ability to go to college. You might have to take out student loans if your parents don't have money to pay for it. That's fair. And we don't live in the same time period that my parents did, where they could work part-time jobs and pay for their education on the side and come out without any student loans, right? That doesn't exist anymore. So you might have to take out some student loans, and that's understandable, and that's why that program is there. But you still have the ability to do it. Even if you don't have a good GPA, even if you barely graduate high school, scraping the bottom rail, you can still go to college. It might be community college for 2 years, and then you might have to transfer, but you still have the ability to go to college and get a college degree in this country, no matter what background you came from. And then, once you have that college degree, if that's the path you choose to do, the options are limitless for you. Or if you don't want to do that, and you want to graduate high school, mention everything I say is going to be graduate from high school. You graduate from high school, and you choose you want to get into a trade, right? You want to learn to work on cars, or you want to be a plumber, you want to be an electrician. You can make nearly 6 figures a year doing those jobs, and they don't require anything else but a high school diploma. And you work and you earn money while you're working, whereas you're not making money while you're in college. You're racking up debt. And if you want to go that route, you have that option too. You have those abilities to make those decisions. And we live in one of the greatest countries in the world where you can literally become anything you want. Anything. As long as you're willing to put the effort into it. Now, you might accrue some debt along the way if your parents don't have money to pay for you to get to school. But as you said before, right? If these people do make this decision, right, and they become college educated, right, and or they choose to trade or they choose a different path in life, and they get a trade and they start making a comfortable living, then they're far more likely to pass on a better quality of life and a better home life to their children, which then breaks that cycle. And then their children are far more likely to go to college or choose a trade right out, far less likely to be in an abusive household, far more likely to be in a household with two parents, far more likely to have those good. So it starts with them. It starts with you. It doesn't start. It doesn't. Every single person has to come from that. I remember one of the earliest things, and this kind of sets to your point. Now that I think about it, it kind of sets to your point. One of the earliest lessons I remember learning was from my dad. Right, your response is your responsibility. Right. Your choices in life are your responsibility. And life is nothing but a series of choices, decisions, and consequences. And sometimes those consequences are good, and sometimes those consequences are bad, but they're always a decision based on what we made. Right? Now, my dad taught me that.
I'll pause there because I agree, but then it makes me think. I need to remember which podcast it was, and there are studies. There are studies that say that your decisions are already predetermined by who knows what. It's a very, very interesting study. They analyze people's brain waves and how they are going to respond to certain scenarios. And they analyze the brain waves shift as they're presented with choices, or so, maybe even before they're even presented with choices, the brain wave already knows what you're going to pick and what you're going to decide. Total side note, but
I'm a completely different person than I was when I was 18 years old.
Oh, yeah.
I'm a completely different person than I was when I was 25 years old.
And I think you're
changed throughout your entire life.
You're exactly, and you gave me the answer that I was looking for. Everybody is different. Everybody starts to take accountability at different places in life. There are psychological factors. There may be even chemical factors in your brain that determine the decisions and the reactions. If you have those chemical imbalances, that you will react differently to things than somebody else. So there's so many factors, and the best thing we can do is ensure that everybody has equal access to opportunities starting from early education, so that later in life they can be personally accountable for their outcome.
Please, if social programs are going to help with that, do it. But at the end of the day, I'm still going to be a proponent of holding people accountable for their choices.
Man, if you
choose to drop out of high school, you choose to have a child with a wedlock, where you don't have the money to support them.
Yeah,
those are your decisions. You made those decisions, and those decisions 80% of the time result in a life under the poverty line. If you just look at who lives under the poverty line, you'll be surprised at how many times those two choices or one of those two choices tied into it.
Yep. And I'll pull up numbers for next time we talk about this, but again, and we see it in the Nordic countries where they ensure that there's that access, and that's why poverty is minimal. It's not because they are getting universal income and food stamps and all those programs. It's because they get ahead with quality early education and setting up their parents for success.